So I had proposed a talk with a few additions to the standards layer and was given, instead of a lightning time talk slot, a whole hour. I will do my best to make this hour worth your while. My name's Jeremy Stent. I'm a programmer analyst at United Heritage. I have been a Plex developer since around 2000, starting work initially in Texas, also working in South Carolina, Georgia, and now here. I have enjoyed many of the past Plex conferences and hope that you are all enjoying this one as well. It is a pity we don't get to meet face to face and have the times of discussion, but it is great that we can have one. Thank you, Roger and CM First, for organizing this. So one of the things that you can do with the standards layer is try and avoid lots of code reentry and also make your programs much more consistent. I noticed Eric had his programs being a much darker gray than I think I normally see. Different buttons or different styles, different tabs. The other thing with a good standards layer is you've got lots of functions to inherit from with almost all of the core UI logic, and then you just have to put in your small pieces of business logic. If you don't have a complete standards layer, you find yourself putting in the same bits of UI logic time and time and time again. So I'm not certain how many people who will end up watching this are have less amounts of experience and how many, like Roger, have been around since the first Plex conference. But hopefully we've all learned that the standards layer is quite useful. A good standards layer must have inherited copies of most of the functions from patterns. If you don't do that, you can't make certain that people use your consistent levels. It does allow customization at just a few points. You can customize the core look and default properties at UI basic shell. And then you can customize the logic. You can add your own prompting, your own validation. It does require that the developers will then use the functions and fields from your standards layer rather than from the core patterns or OBase. But that is something that a little bit of training and practice can get us used to. One of the first patterns I would like to show is adding an environment string. I was getting emails from business users complaining about things, and I was never certain if this was stuff that I was broken in development or broken in production. So I ended up deciding to stick a title bar, a text string in the title bar and on the panels, so that when I got screen prints, I could know where it was from. Since then, the users have told me they appreciate it because they don't accidentally start trying to enter production data in test or test data in production. They can easily glance at it and know. This is composed of a small static.
Can you show your screen, Jeremy?
Pardon?
Can you show your screen? Do you have a?
Oh.
Am I missing something here?
No, you're right. I forgot to share my screen. Okay. Where'd Zoom go to? Zoom. Full screen presentations and Zoom.
Better to mention it now than at the end of the presentation, right?
Pardon?
Better to mention that now than at the end of your presentation.
Yes, thank you. Is the core Zoom window.
So you should have a share screen down at the bottom in the center.
Exit minimized. That'll help me find it. Somehow Zoom had gone. I thought I was sharing the screen. Could people not see that?
We just see you.
No. There was an extra button I forgot to press called share.
There we go.
So sorry about that, folks. Okay. I clicked on share, I clicked on screen, and I forgot to click on share again. So yes, an extra string at the top of the panel or top of the title bar in the panel. This is, in my case, I stored it in the database such that depending on which database you connect to is which string you get to see. Panel string here or here. And it was just a small addition at UI basic shell to call a function to look up the string and then to prepend it to the title bar and set the static to that value. It does unfortunately require that on any panel you put this static in the right place. But after that, it's easy to tell the difference between test and development. Well, production, I leave it blank so it doesn't show at all. But it was just one small thing, and the users have told me they found it useful. And as a developer, I much prefer getting screen prints that tell me where they came from. So that one, I do plan on providing a Word document with all of the action diagram code pasted into that. We're still reviewing whether or not we can share our standards layer with the world, just in case there's any sensitive field values. But UI basic shell, over here. View show local. I don't usually use this computer, and it's grabbing hotkeys. I don't like it too. That was predefined. Start initialize, fetch the environment string. The fetch environment string just calls an external function, which could read it from a registry value, a database, have it compiled in. And then if it's not blank, it uses the API to set the value of the static in my case. Some people use, you could use a field instead. And then in the set panel caption, I added an extra piece to say if it wasn't blank, then prepend it to the panel caption. So small little thing, almost no effort to add that to your standards, but it does help you and everyone else remember where you're running in your own environment, in the test, in the production. So the other one, date prompting, apparently this isn't needed for .NET, but rather than every single date field on any panel that we wanted the user to be able to press F4 on, just a little piece of metacode, or slightly more complex if you're not using ISO dates, you can have all of your panel date fields on the panel support prompting, double click or F4, just from having the metacode pre-added to your templates. So if you're the sort that likes buttons next to it, I'm afraid I haven't been able to do the Windows API code to add buttons. But if you do, you can just add a little button and make the action diagram code for the event set focus to the panel, to the field, and go sub prompt processing and 2 lines of action diagram for any buttons you want next to it. This way, I don't have to worry any new entity, any new panel. I don't have to worry about adding prompting for any of the date fields on there. It just comes in automatically. Once again, I will have the meta functions and so on in the composition document, companion document. So with this one, you can either have a meta function that looks at all of the regions on the panel, or you can have one that looks at each region individually. Either way, it doesn't take much. The one advantage of each region individually is you can have more specific code to do things based on which date just got updated and an edit point afterwards. Another piece of meta function I decided to write. This one was caused by a green screen application that didn't show negative signs. And occasionally the users would reach over and hit the field minus and didn't realize they put in a negative sign, and then our reports went really, really weird. So I decided to make my panels be a bit more specific. And if I try typing in a negative number of outstanding orders, it will automatically give me an error as long as I have tagged the field as a non-negative field. So this way I take advantage. I don't know who added it at CA, but I greatly appreciate it. The field special type name, and I just have my metacode look for any field that is marked as non-negative and it will then give you an error if that field is input capable. That was a simple piece of for each property target. If it's a number, if it's non-negative, if it's input capable, cast it to a local double, just because I wanted to compare to a 0 and I didn't want errors if there were any field limits on the thing. And then try and find an appropriate field name for the message and get that. This one got added to our standards. View usage. This one got added to our standards at the edit detail, the edit insert, the edit update, handful of places. A lot of these are where we're supporting extra grids for a couple of our really weird panels. So another simple one, but it does mean that as a lazy programmer, I have a lot less code to put in for any date prompting or negative date value, negative number validation. And this one is similar to the other. We had users who were trying to enter dates that were before 1900, and we were storing them in a database that was a date 7, and some of our other RPG programs blew up when they encountered negative numbers in a date 7. So they asked me to prevent it on that one field, and I said that's going to be incomplete because you'll be doing the same error on other fields, and developed something that says any date you enter has to be within plus or minus about 18 months. I put a special type name on them such that you can have dates like birth dates or country start foundation dates or other dates that you want that can be outside of that range. But this way, it's just a little bit of safety to try and prevent data entry errors when people enter a date that is too far out of range. Whoops. Shouldn't have pressed escape there. So once again, if I try and enter a date that's next call date 2030, accidentally type 30 instead of 20, it should have given me an error on that. Let's try 1830. It's too long ago. I guess at the moment I'm just checking old dates instead of future dates, but please use a more recent date. And this way I don't have to remember to do it on every date field that I work on. It's just automatic, except if I want a date like an effective date that's too long ago, that one I did tag as being able to support old dates. Thought I tagged effective date as being able to support old dates. The one other thing I had to do for this one was to support that you can edit a record, and as long as you don't change the date, it doesn't complain about it being too old. I have to have an original variable in any functions. A lot of us have that in some of our patterns anyway, but that it was validate. Check for old dates, but it just had to make certain that they all had an original variable that was populated and updated for comparison values. Original is loaded when we load the record, or if we fetch the record, or if we initialize it new, and then down here in the initial, in the compare for dates, if it's a date, if it's input capable, if it's not empty, if it's not equal to original, then we go ahead and do the checking. So just one thing you could make that a warning message if you wanted, but it does hopefully help reduce and prevent errors. Slide deck. Slideshow. Okay. Banded grids, I believe .NET has that automatically. It's one of the things you see in accounting programs, and it helps you to scroll from one side of a grid to the other and remember which row you were on. In our case, we've made a small pattern that just automatically, as you load the grid, alternates between two states and makes the grid banded. You could do every other row if you wanted, so that it would be two highlighted, two not. It does mean that if you've got something else that uses grid states to show active or inactive or something like, or any other conditionals, this will fight with that. But it is another small thing. You can just make any grid you want to inherit from it. And in your UI basic shell, you define your colors for the grid. In the grid, you define your colors for state 1 and state 2, and then view. I'm so used to using these hotkeys that on this computer that's stealing them, I'm getting annoyed. Just as you're loading the grid, process grid row to add, you set the grid state, and this particular function just checks if the current grid row is odd or even and sets the state to highlighted or default. Just gives one extra piece that makes the panels a bit easier to read, a bit nicer. Yeah. So there's an example of this banded grid. So mine inherits from grid and another one for grid 2. And in our model, we go all the way up to grid 7. This was one of my most recent ones. I noticed Andrew was using something sort of similar, but I've decided to try and make it easier for users to consistently file a bug report with us. If they've decided that something isn't working right, they can just press Shift-Control-B is what I just chose, and it will automatically grab a screen print. It will to show what they're showing. That way we can always get a consistent screen print instead of a screen capture that's only part of it. It will also dump out all of the fields using metacode similar to Andrew's, except instead of logging them to the log, I write them out to a text file. You could write them out to a database. You can do other things if you wanted. Every single field, every single variable. For the panel, the grids, I haven't yet extended it to try dumping all the grid rows, but it does show you also for each panel field, if it's input capable at the moment and which one has focus. So you can hopefully understand where things are going. And that way they can just fill in, they can finish filling in the details in an email to help desk. You could preload the help desk email address. Subject bug report. I'll have the function name from the bug dump. If you had an automatic ticketing system, you could file these with an API. And I get a much more consistent bug report that way. Don't know if other people would find it useful as a developer, not as an end user. Like Andrew's debug statements, I think it's quite handy to be able to just press a function key and automatically have a text file created, and in this case opened up with an email that I can go through and learn what the current value of every function field for every function variable is. I try and, in my example, I try and dump every variable group, panel, report, web page section. And then I also try and dump every field. If it's an array, I put an array index and dump every record of the array. And then for the panel, I also do a pre and post get, just because we all know sometimes we've forgotten to do a get or we've forgotten to do a put. So it's nice to know the difference. It required, in my case, modifying UI basic shell and having a pattern function to do the dumps, a place to write them, and a function to actually file the bug report. So bug report here calls the source code. And this, I admit, I scraped Stack Overflow and various other places, but it calls the source code to do a capture a screen print. It saves that to the text file, to the temp, adds them as an attachment, and after the message is sent, it'll try and clean up by deleting the files from there. Just one of those things that hopefully will give us more consistent and thus more answerable bug reports. A couple of other places it did need changes. UI frame parent and frame child. In case they press the hotkey and the wrong one captures it, I disabled the hotkey at the frame child level, so the frame parent will always capture it, and then ask the frame parent when it's doing a bug report to request that all of the children will file a bug report into the same text file. Will file their fields. So it does bloat your code a bit, but having the hotkey, if a user calls up and complains, you can tell them just press this hotkey, fill out the email, and send it to us. Alternatives, you could send an email, you could submit it by FTP or web service or whatever your preference for a ticketing system is. This is another one I've developed recently. I imagine most of us have at one time or another programmed dynamically loaded combo boxes. For instance, I've got the country and the state here. In my case, country code is dynamically loaded from one table, and based on the country, we've got various states. And for my purpose, it was whether this state is supported for our company doing business there or not. We may be able to mail out stuff, but we shouldn't accept orders from people not in those states. And I felt that every time, especially if you're using a pop-up edit windows, having to go off and reload the combo box from the database every time the window's open was inefficient. So I created a little pattern that will cache whatever columns you're interested in into shared data, and then have a process group that will, or a block fetch that will read the shared data for loading. And then I made my combo box use load the cache data first, and then combo box, and then load it from the cache data. It loads to the panel. I have monitored the database, and after the first load, it doesn't talk to the database again. Downside is if any admin goes in and modifies the values, you don't notice it until you restart your program. The upside is a whole lot fewer network calls and hopefully some lower database load, which the larger your shop is, the more you may notice that. Once again, in fact, where can I get a chat window? Can I get a chat window? I'll put the Word document in the chat window when I can get more chat. The date picker, yes, I'll give some information on that towards the end. File, my computer, this PC, oops, this PC. So Word document is now available in the chat window for anyone who wants it. Another one that I was finding annoying is I set up several of our entities to be cascade warn, cascade error instead of cascade delete. You can view usage. you can see owned by country table dependency error. And by default, that means if you try and delete a country that's in use, you get just an error. The user doesn't know why it's an error. So I took the metacode that the delete row uses and put that in our delete panels, such that if you try and delete a normal row, I actually tell you, you won't be able to delete this one. It's in use by and the name of the table. So that way the users don't get some sort of confusing delete message and say, what's that about? So it does take being added to a few panels, and then you sometimes want to override the message for a bit clearer one, but it does grant the ability to give the users more clarification on delete if you use the cascade error. Another one that I particularly like is a pattern to clear output fields. I don't know if the rest of you have encountered this on the IBMI, but sometimes you call a function and it returns the values from the last call instead. So if I'm writing a function on specifically a server function, I just make them inherit from here and automatically show local. And automatically the initialize uses a subroutine which will clear out all the output fields, including trying to iterate through any arrays and clear those out as well. That way I just know that if I call a function, I'm not being fed back the data from the previous time. Oops. I've also got a pattern to allow you to use the native dialog boxes, which allows you to pick an icon. I didn't put that in the demo. And pick whether it's a yes, no, cancel, or just a yes, no, or an okay, cancel, or an array of buttons. But for some of us who are fed up with that, trying to ask, do you want to delete this? Yes, no. And we have to say yes, no, cancel. It can be a bit nicer to just inherit from have a fancy dialog and then set a few fields and go to the fancy enquiry message, which allows you to specify a caption, allows you to specify which button mix you want, which icon you want to use, what the default button is. You can pick whether that's going to be button 1, 2, or 3, and get back the reply. It isn't quite as nice as a native just enquiry message line, but having the option to pick what the button pieces are and how many of them you want, it just gives your inquiry messages a bit nicer of a look. Minimum panel resize. I know a lot of us have liked to make our grids resizable, but if you don't set the resize correctly, people can resize it down to something that's completely useless. In our case, we developed a pattern that listens for the Windows on resize event, and the developer puts in at the program time what the minimum sizes for this panel should be, and then it just catches the things that are being shrunk down too small and tells Windows that's the smallest I want you to make it. Edit, view, show local. So we do have to put in on each panel the minimum panel width and the minimum panel height as action diagram lines. And any panel that we want to use this on, we just have to inherit from a set min resize. You could add this to your UI basic shell if you wanted. Set min resize registers a panel event. has a panel event. It registers in the process options. It registers to trap the Windows message, set min-max info, and then uses some source code to say if the min-max info is, if either one of the dimensions is less than we like, then you can just set the right one. Another one, this was something I developed. It's a really simple one. I got fed up with on panel after panel trying to put a close button on the bottom right corner. I found I was sometimes forgetting to fix it bottom right. I was sometimes forgetting to wire up the event, various things. So I just made a quick entity as a UI basic shell, has a button which is prefixed for the bottom right in its own region. So anytime I want a close button now, I can just inherit from that and automatically have a close button, position it, it's all set. Don't have to remember to wire up an event, don't have to remember to fix it. So that's, in my point, to my thinking, a lot easier to just add a triple saying this one has a close button than it is to put a button on the panel, set the bitmap, set the caption, set the event. So much less, fewer things to forget about there. Now, I see Roger had asked about the date picker. I had considered talking about that. The date picker is, the traditional one is an ActiveX control, which Microsoft no longer provides, and I was never clear on the licensing. But happily, since Windows 8 at least, I think it might be 7, Windows has had a built-in date picker. All you have to do is use lots of source code to talk to it. It isn't, unfortunately, selected, unfortunately isn't ActiveX. So my panel just has a big blank area. And then at runtime, show local. Thought that was the right one. Use this select date. View show local. At runtime, it uses some code to create and capture, try to figure out how to size it. It creates a copy of the Windows calendar picker, which you can also get from, well, you used to be able to get from there. Creates it, registers it for resizing. If it doesn't work, we get an error. And then I've got the panel events that are on resize. I'll resize the control with it. So this, I can, if people are interested, I can export that to XML for people to import in their own models. It does, as I said, it's not an ActiveX control, so you can't see it at design time, but you only ever need one date selector anyway.
So Jeremy, if you'll do that, if you'll export that to an XML file, we'll make sure we distribute it as part of this release. And that alone will justify the whole conference right there.
One thing I've considered I should have added at the beginning was a parameter for the title bar, so that when you're prompting for a date in your meta code, you can say, please select contract start date, please select default date, whatever, and have your window just be a little bit more user-friendly.
You put all that stuff in it before you export it out to XML. We want all the bells and whistles. We want all the good stuff. So really just trick it out and then export it as an XML, and we'll attach it to this session, okay?
Yeah, I don't know that I want to add parameters to our standards layer now, because then anything that calls them would be in trouble. But I can do it without saving the standards, I imagine, and then export it.
Work your magic, work your magic.
So one of those things you no longer have to worry, does the computer have that old ActiveX control that was bundled, I think, with Internet Explorer? If it wasn't Office, I can't remember which one.
It's the world's clunkiest date picker. The one that we get from Plex, it's the world's worst. It works, but it is the world's worst.
I don't think we get it from Plex. I
I
think
know,
it
but
was
it's
always,
it's the one that we just have, everyone's been using it, you know. I mean, some people have replaced it, but it's the one that's just traditionally used by a Plex application.
mhm,
I think it's part of the active library. I don't
yeah.
know.
But the ActiveX control that the active library uses is no longer distributed.
I know. I know.
So,
That's why we're going to use yours.
okay.
Yep.
So, I mean, you can think of lots of other things. You can do all sorts of things based on field special type name for validation or highlighting or formatting. In your standards layer, it's useful to define all of your number formats that you want to use. Around at my company, we had someone who decided that all numbers should have the minus sign in the front. I never quite figured out why, but we were able to do that by putting masks on all of our numbers at the standards layer. And since most of our fields inherited from there, we then had negative numbers on the front at the next rebuild. If you want to, I've known one company that liked all of their promptable fields to be yellow. So you can have some metacode in your standards function that mirrors the code to do the prompting to turn all promptable fields yellow. And then you just have to remember to do that in the show detail regions and after validate detail. I don't have that one here because we don't turn our field yellow. I don't know if you noticed, but my panels are all white. And the last rebuild, to make certain the users knew that it had been rebuilt, we went with white. And since then, I've had a fair bit of flack because it's too bright. But for the next rebuild, we can change the colors back to the gray and people will know about it. You can also change at your standards layer. We've changed our default for the fields to be flat instead of indented. It's one of those things you can define if you make certain everything eventually inherits from UI basic shell. You just have to go into your panel palette and for your control defaults, edit most of your control defaults here. And it should inherit from there down to every function that you use. I opened up the wrong one.
Yep.
UI basic shell, that's the one I wanted. I thought the color was wrong. This is the one that has our environment string on it. The company added a help about. I've now made it pick up the bug report. And at the control defaults for the edits, we have set them to be a standard border instead of an indented. I know Windows 8, that was supposedly the wave of the future. Everything was supposed to be flat and invisible, so you never knew where to work. They're going back from that now, but at least we're only about 5 years behind. But the advantage of having a standards layer with everything inheriting from it is you can change things at the standards layer, and at your next rebuild, everything will then look the same. I know I went through that quickly and might not have had quite enough material. My contact information is on the slide deck, which I believe will be distributed. If anyone has questions or wants feedback on what they're working on, feel free to contact me. I haven't seen many extra questions in the chat window. Were there any other questions from anyone?
Great presentation. There's really some good stuff there. I like that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Oh, hi, Jeremy. How you're managing the like a document for the other developer, which standard layer does what kind of? I know you know, but I think if you share with other people who come here, it's a name tells almost everything, or is there like you writing up some document always up to date, etc.
I didn't quite understand what you were asking, Kyoshi.
Oh, I mean, a standard layer is great, and then once you creator knows what to do. But for the other people, it's like what's the combination of what's the best way to like organizing things. So that's just curious. I mean, it's a documentation is always other thing, but yeah, just wondering.
Well, in a small shop, and most Plex shops
Mm-hmm.
I've been at were small, you
Okay.
just have sort of oral tradition. You examine what other
Mm-hmm.
people have done. You train each other. In a larger shop, you'd want to have a wiki.
Mm-hmm.
I know it is possible to define help for your entities. I've seen it done. We haven't done that
Yeah,
much
that's
here.
too much. Yeah, because you need to use very
So,
old format, right?
yes. But
Yeah.
generally, especially for new developers, you can tell them, here's a panel. I want you to do something similar to this one over another entity. And then they can study, well, what's this triple do? What's that triple do? What's this piece of code do? So yeah, learning is one of those things as Plex developers who've worked a while, where especially those of us who are used to patterns, we know the um, edit detail, we know the we know the owned cascade. In our case, the developers of the standards layer here took just about every entity, most of the functions available in the patterns layers, and inherited from those. When they were making the edit detail ones, they swapped out the inherited functions, replaces the pattern one with a local one, just to keep everything funneling through the code that we have here. That way, if we added something to edit insert, if we added something to edit detail grid, or even well, edit detail grid, it would ripple through all of the mirrors of our patterns that we have. So, and that way, people who come here, we tell them, please use if they're an experienced Plex developer, we would tell them, please use the copy and standards. If they're someone that doesn't know Plex well, then we would tell them, give them much more information as they learn. We would say, please inherit your new entity from has description. Please inherit it from owned cascade. And these are the replaces triples to use, and then develop your functions from there. So
I guess, and Jeremy, in our shop, we use lists to communicate to developers what we want them to use, because some of the things in the standards layer are just building blocks for other stuff in the standards layer, and we don't want them to use those building blocks. So we created lists, use the list object there in Plex, and create like an abstract entity list, an abstract function list, an abstract field list. So that's what we tell our developers to look at to know what to use as their building blocks. So we found that helpful to train people.
okay. And you prefer lists to subject areas?
We started with subject areas, and now I can't remember why we stopped using them.
Okay.
That was, I think we started with subject areas early on. Before, I don't think the list object existed right away. But there was some other use for subject areas, I think, that made them not as attractive.
Because I like to keep lists. I don't know if this should have been in one of the earlier tip sessions. I like to keep lists as things I'm currently working on. So for every change request, whether it be a feature or something, I create a list for CR 9999 fix, no, add field to customer. That might be too long. Add field to cust. And once I've set that, I believe if I first set it, I've got to reopen the model if there wasn't one already in there. Any changes I make get automatically added to that list. So I like to keep the lists for changes. That way I can always remember what was in any particular thing I was working on, as long as I do remember to change the model options. Whereas subject areas, I like for groupings of things that belong together.
Yeah, we use that as well. And actually, there's another option in the Plex options that you have to say log modified options or log modified objects to a list.
You have
That
to turn
also
that
has
on.
to be selected, but I think it might be selected by default. So
Okay.
you might not need to set that, but it's under
general
general
options.
yeah, where is that?
But one of the other tips that people might enjoy remembering is I think you can define somewhere. I thought you could define the characters that expanded.
There's your
Oh,
list mate.
yeah.
It's automatically log modified.
Right
But I
there.
thought somewhere you could define which characters expanded in the synonyms. There we go. So comment, I believe, currently sort of has a semicolon as a synonym, but you can define, if you the sort that prefers star asterisk, you could add that as a synonym and use it. Or if you prefer hyphen hyphen for your comments.
So you're
Once
on
you
commit.
find those.
You're on commit, not comment.
No wonder there was nothing on there.
So close.
Wrong one. Anyway, so once you define that, you can use what you prefer when you're typing your action diagram statements. Most of us don't care too much about them, but this was a commonly used, there we go, semicolon, asterisk, slash, slash. But if you like, for instance, if you're from SQL and you prefer to use comment hyphens, you could define one there. Or if you just wanted DM for dialogue message, if you do a lot of those, you could define DM and have that auto expand. Don't know if the hotkeys will work, but since you were unmuted, if I'm adding a subroutine, like you said you had your hotkey thing. Nope, that hotkey isn't making it through an unfull screen remote desktop. This thing, when I'm on full screen remote desktop, pops open this. I can then say I want to new subroutine with a comment. And ace type, that's the one. New subroutine comment, subroutine. It pulls my last set CR number. You can see what it's going to paste down here. Today's date and my name for the comment. And I'm supposed to paste that in there. Normally it does the paste for me as well. But this way I can just have, you saw I have several code snippets defined. I've got new subroutine, no comment. If I'm doing a name, the debug is more for when I'm trying to review code, but process group filter, haven't used that one in a while. New code or removed code if you're one of the shops that likes to put sequences around any code for a change. Comment pulls in the current date, the user, the CR, and when I'm changing CRs, I'm supposed to remember to come here and just change my CR number I'm working on. And then it just uses that as auto inserts afterwards. It also does keep a history of things. So if you were putting the same subroutine in a couple of functions, you can just use the down arrow when you're doing an ace paste. Ace type, I mean. being grumpy today. Yeah. Presentations, they always cause trouble. So, but it is a pay-for piece of software, but being able to just copy things into there, make a new clip piece and save them and then reuse them, I find is worth the cost. Oops, shouldn't be opening that. So I thank you for your attention, and I hope that this has been of some use. I will work on getting that date selector to Roger so that he can share it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Great session, Jeremy. Thank you very much. Okay, everybody, we've got 8 more minutes till the next session, so you got to take a bio break. Now's the time.